Poor young girl wed a 77-year-old millionaire. 1 week later, she was stunned by what she saw. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The morning light spilled through the dusty windows of a small diner on the edge of Chicago. Maya Reed wiped her hands on her apron, her shoulders aching after another 10-hour shift. The coffee pot hissed on the warmer, half full, its smell heavy in the air. Outside, the wind chased yellow leaves across cracked pavement, whispering of places she had never been. Maya was 23, but life had aged her faster. Every dollar she earned disappeared into the hospital fund for her little brother, who was fighting a weak heart at St. Anne's Medical Center. Her eyes were tired, her hope thinner than the soles of her shoes. She never complained, but each night she wondered how long she could keep going before she broke. The bell over the diner door chimed. She looked up, expecting one of the regulars. Instead, an unfamiliar figure stepped inside a tall man in a long gray coat, his silver hair perfectly combed, his posture straight and measured. He moved like someone used to silence and respect. When he sat down at the counter, the room seemed to hush around him. "Good morning, sir," Maya said softly, reaching for the coffee pot. The man nodded once. His voice, when it came, was deep and calm. "You are Maya Reed, are you not?" Her hand froze midair. "Yes, sir. Do I know you?" He placed a folded envelope on the counter. "Not yet. But I know about your brother's condition, and I know you have refused every offer of charity. You remind me of someone I once knew." She stared, heart hammering. "How do you know all that?" "I have my ways," he replied. "My name is Edward Lane. I am here to make you an offer. It may sound strange, but I ask you to listen until the end." Maya's throat tightened. "What kind of offer?" "I want you to marry me," he said evenly. "A legal arrangement, nothing more. You will have financial security. Your brother will have the surgery he needs, and you will live in my home as my wife. For 1 year." Her breath caught. "Marry you?" "Yes. In return, I ask only honesty and respect. There will be no obligations beyond the agreement." For a moment, she could not speak. The ticking clock filled the silence, marking the distance between sense and madness. He seemed calm, kind even, but the offer was unbelievable. "Why me?" she whispered. Edward looked at her with eyes that held a quiet ache. "Because you still believe in decency when the world has given you every reason not to." Maya felt her knees weaken. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and rain. She thought of her brother, of bills she could not pay, and of this man who spoke like he had known loss too. Her voice trembled. "If this is real, I will do it." "Oh." Edward Lane gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "Then your life is about to change, Miss Reed." She could not know that the man sitting across from her, the man she believed to be 77 years old, was hiding a truth that would turn her world upside down. The contract was drawn up 2 days later. The autumn air had turned colder, pressing gray clouds against the Chicago skyline. Maya Reed sat in a quiet conference room at the top floor of Lane Industries, her hands folded in her lap. The table before her gleamed like glass, and the smell of leather and paper filled the air. Across from her sat Edward Lane, the same man who had walked into her diner as if out of a dream. He wore a charcoal suit and a look that was calm but unreadable. The lawyer, a tall man with thinning hair, adjusted his glasses and spoke with careful precision. "Miss Reed, this agreement outlines the terms of your marriage to Mr. Lane. You are not to discuss the arrangement publicly. You will reside in Mr. Lane's estate for 1 calendar year. You will receive an allowance for personal needs and full coverage for your brother's treatment at St. Anne's Medical Center." Maya nodded silently, her eyes on the thick pages before her. The words blurred together: confidential, duration, termination, non-disclosure. They did not sound like the language of love or even kindness. They sounded like business. Still, every line reminded her of her brother's fragile heartbeat, and that was enough. The lawyer continued. "There is one final clause. Upon completion of the year, Miss Reed, you will receive an education grant and full independence. No further obligations will remain." Maya took a slow breath. And if I choose to leave early? Edward's voice broke the silence. Then the agreement ends immediately, and the benefits end with it. The lawyer placed the pen on the table. If both parties understand, please sign. Maya reached for the pen. Her hand trembled slightly, but she steadied herself. For my brother, she whispered under her breath. Then she signed. Edward followed, his movements precise and deliberate. When he looked up, his eyes softened for the first time. Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Lane. The sound of those words made her chest tighten. She was someone's wife now, though she had never worn a white dress or heard the sound of vows spoken in a church. There was only paper, ink, and silence. That evening, a car arrived to take her to the estate. The driver, a quiet man in a black coat, opened the door without a word. The city faded behind her as they drove north toward the lake. Streetlights flickered past the windows like brief stars. She pressed her hand to the glass, feeling the cold seep through. Everything she had known, her apartment, the diner, her routine, was shrinking in the distance. When the gates opened, she caught her breath. The Lane estate was vast, surrounded by iron fences and old trees stripped bare by the season. The mansion stood at the end of a long driveway, its windows glowing faintly in the dusk. It looked more like a museum than a home, grand but heavy with silence. The housekeeper met her at the door. "Good evening, Mrs. Lane," the woman said, with a polite but distant tone. "My name is Helen. I manage the household staff. Mr. Lane prefers punctuality and quiet. Dinner is served at 7 sharp." Maya nodded, trying to smile. "Thank you." Helen's eyes moved over her simple dress and worn shoes. "I see," she murmured, as if filing away an opinion. Then she turned and walked down the hall. The interior of the house was a world of its own, paintings of unknown faces, chandeliers that reflected like frozen rain, carpets so thick her footsteps vanished into them. A portrait above the fireplace caught her eye. A young woman in an ivory gown, smiling faintly. Maya guessed it was Edward's late wife. When she entered the dining room, Edward was already seated at the head of the long table. He stood as she approached, every movement slow and deliberate. "Please, sit." "Ok." The meal was quiet. The sound of cutlery and the faint ticking of a clock filled the room. Maya kept her eyes on her plate, unsure what to say. "You may relax, Mrs. Lane," he said after a moment. "This is not a prison." "I know," she replied softly. "It is just different." He gave a small smile. Different can be good, or it can be lonely. Their eyes met briefly. There was something in his gaze that made her forget the difference in age for a heartbeat, an echo of youth, or perhaps sorrow. After dinner, Helen showed Maya to her room on the second floor. The space was larger than her entire apartment, with cream curtains and a bed draped in white linen. A small vase of fresh lilies stood on the nightstand. Before leaving, Helen said, "Mr. Lane values privacy. You will find him in the library most evenings. I suggest you do not disturb him unless necessary." When the door closed, Maya exhaled slowly. The quiet pressed around her like a heavy blanket. She walked to the window. The garden below was lit by soft lanterns, their glow trembling in the wind. Somewhere, far off, she heard faint piano music drifting through the corridors, notes slow and deliberate, like someone remembering a song from another life. Maya sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers brushing the silver band on her ring finger. It did not feel like marriage, not really. It felt like an arrangement made with ghosts. She thought of her brother, of the promise she had made to herself never to let anyone buy her dignity. Yet here she was, wearing a stranger's name and living in a house that was not hers. Still, beneath all that doubt, something about Edward Lane lingered in her mind. There had been gentleness in his voice, as though he carried secrets he could not tell. She wondered what kind of man chose to marry a poor waitress he barely knew. The piano music stopped. Silence returned. Maya whispered into the emptiness. "What have I gotten myself into?" She lay down but did not sleep. In the stillness of that grand and lonely mansion, she could not know that the man she now called her husband, the man she believed to be 77, was already watching from the library window, his hand resting on a mask of silver hair that was not his own. The following morning began with the sound of rain against the glass. The sky above the Lane estate hung low and gray, wrapping the gardens in mist. Maya Reed sat at the small vanity near her window, brushing her dark hair into a loose knot. Her reflection looked unfamiliar in the soft morning light. The ring on her finger gleamed faintly, as if reminding her of the choice she had made only days ago. A soft knock came at the door. Helen, the housekeeper, entered carrying a tray of breakfast, porridge, tea, and a single slice of toast arranged neatly on fine china. "Mr. Lane prefers to eat in the study this morning," Helen said. "He asked that you join him after you finish." Maya nodded. "Thank you." Helen's expression remained unreadable. "Do not keep him waiting too long." When Helen left, Maya stared at the meal. She had never been served breakfast in her life. Every morning at the diner had been a rush of burnt toast and instant coffee. Here, even silence felt expensive. When she finally gathered her courage and made her way downstairs, she found the study door slightly open. Inside, the fire was already burning, and Edward Lane sat in a high-backed chair near the window. He looked up from his newspaper when she entered. "Good morning, Mrs. Lane," he said. "Good morning," she replied softly. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Please, sit." She obeyed, smoothing her skirt nervously. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of the rain filled the room. Edward folded his newspaper carefully and set it aside. "Did you sleep well?" "Not really," she admitted. "It is a beautiful house, but it feels too quiet." He gave a small nod. "Silence can be a heavy companion. You will grow used to it in time." She studied him across the firelight. Even in the calm warmth of the room, he looked like a man carved from solitude, composed, yet carrying something unspoken behind his eyes. Edward poured tea into 2 porcelain cups and passed one to her. "Tell me about your brother," he said. Her face softened. "His name is Daniel. He has been sick since birth. Doctors say his heart is weak, but he is stronger than they think. He dreams about going to the ocean someday. He has never seen it." Edward listened without interrupting. "Then he will see it," he said finally. "I will make sure of that." Maya blinked. "You already do enough. You do not have to promise more." "It is not a promise," he replied. "It is something I want to do." The words settled into the space between them. For the first time, Maya sensed warmth beneath his reserved demeanor. When Helen entered to clear the tray, Edward rose from his chair. "Come," he said to Maya. "There is something I want to show you." She followed him down a long corridor lined with framed paintings. At the end stood a heavy oak door. Edward opened it, revealing a sunroom overlooking the garden. Despite the rain, the room glowed softly with natural light filtering through tall glass panes. "This was my wife's favorite place," he said quietly. "She used to paint here every morning." Maya stepped closer. An unfinished canvas still rested on an easel, a sketch of flowers, frozen mid-bloom. Dust covered the edges, but the brushstrokes felt alive. "I am sorry," she said gently. Edward smiled faintly. "Do not be. She has been gone for many years, but I find that memory does not fade, it only softens." He turned toward the garden, watching droplets trace down the glass. "I keep this room as it was. It reminds me that some things are worth remembering, even if they hurt." Maya felt a quiet ache in her chest. She did not know what to say, so she simply stood beside him. After a long pause, Edward spoke again. "I understand that this arrangement is difficult for you, but you have handled it with grace. That is rare." She met his eyes. "I am just trying to do what is right. My brother depends on me." "And that," he said, "is what makes you different." Later that day, Helen approached Maya in the hall with her usual clipped tone. "Mr. Lane will attend a dinner with the board this evening. You will not be required to join." Maya hesitated. "May I read in the library while he is away?" Helen seemed surprised. "If you wish. The library is to the left of the grand staircase. But remember, some rooms are private." When night fell, Maya wandered through the vast halls. The library was enormous shelves reaching the ceiling, 1,000 stories whispering through dust and time. She pulled out an old poetry book and sat near the window, reading by the firelight. It was peaceful until she heard faint footsteps echoing beyond the door. Curious, she peeked into the hallway. The lights were dim. She caught sight of Edward at the far end of the corridor, walking with an ease that startled her. His steps were quick and steady, not at all like those of a 77-year-old man. He disappeared around a corner before she could speak. Maya frowned, confused. Perhaps she had imagined it. Still, the image stayed in her mind the way he moved, light and sure-footed. When he returned later that night, she pretended to be asleep. From the crack of her bedroom door, she saw him pass through the hallway again. This time, she noticed something else. His silver hair looked slightly different, the color uneven near his collar, as if something beneath it was darker. Her breath caught. She turned away quickly, heart racing. It could not be what she thought. Maybe it was the light. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on her. But when she lay down and closed her eyes, the thought would not leave her. What if Edward Lane, the man the world believed to be 77, was not who he claimed to be at all? Outside, the rain fell harder. Inside, beneath the roof of the grand and silent mansion, one secret began to stir awake. The rain eased by morning, leaving behind a thin fog that clung to the gardens of the Lane estate. Maya Reed woke to the faint hum of the grandfather clock down the hall. It was her 4th day in the mansion, yet the place still felt like a museum where she did not belong. She dressed simply, choosing a soft gray sweater and plain slacks. When she opened her door, Helen was already waiting in the corridor, holding a small notepad. "Mr. Lane is in the breakfast room," Helen said. "He asked for your company." Maya followed, her footsteps quiet on the polished floor. When she entered, Edward Lane was standing by the window, gazing out at the mist curling over the lake. He turned when he heard her. "Good morning, Mrs. Lane," he said in his steady voice. "Good morning," she replied, taking the seat across from him. The breakfast table was set with fruit, pastries, and tea. She poured herself a cup, trying not to spill it under his calm but watchful gaze. For a while, they ate in silence. Then Edward said, "I am told you spent some time in the library last night." Maya froze. "Yes, I could not sleep." "I am glad you found it," he said mildly. "Books are better company than people, most days." His words carried a softness that surprised her. "Do you read often?" she asked. "Every night," he replied. "It helps me remember that the world is larger than my mistakes." The sentence lingered in the air. Maya looked up, studying the man before her. There was something unusual about him, something that did not fit the image of an aging millionaire. His posture was straight, his voice firm, his hands steady. Even the way he lifted his teacup, graceful, precise, felt younger than 77. After breakfast, Edward suggested they walk the garden paths. The fog was thinning, and sunlight began to stretch across the wet grass. As they walked, Maya noticed that his steps were sure and strong, not the cautious stride of an elderly man. He noticed her glance but said nothing. "You are quiet today," he remarked. "I'm still learning what to say in a place like this," she answered. He smiled faintly. "Then say what feels true. People in my world stopped doing that long ago." They reached the stone bridge that crossed the pond. The reflection of the house shimmered in the water below. For a moment, Maya forgot who she was supposed to be, a contract wife, a guest in a stranger's home, and simply breathed. "Mr. Lane," she began softly, "why did you choose me?" He stopped walking and looked toward the horizon. "Because kindness is a rare currency. I saw it in you the first moment I met you. I wanted to see if it could survive wealth." The answer confused her and comforted her at the same time. Before she could ask more, Helen appeared at the end of the bridge, calling, "Mr. Lane, you have a visitor in the study." Edward's expression changed. The warmth in his face cooled back into formality. "Thank you, Helen," he said. Then to Maya, "Please enjoy the garden, as long as you like." He left with quick, confident steps, his coat shifting lightly in the breeze. Maya watched him go, her suspicion returning. He moved like a man half his age. Later that afternoon, she wandered back toward the house. From the hallway, she heard muffled voices coming from the study. She did not mean to eavesdrop, but one sentence stopped her cold. "The disguise will not hold forever, Edward," a man's voice said. "Someone will notice." Maya pressed her hand against the wall, her pulse racing. Edward's voice came next, low but firm. "Let them. This arrangement was never about appearances. It is about truth." Maya stepped back quietly, heart pounding. Disguise. The word echoed in her mind like thunder. That evening, the house felt different. She could not shake what she had heard. At dinner, she barely touched her food. Edward spoke little, and Helen's presence was sharper than usual. When Edward excused himself early, Maya remained at the table, staring at the flickering candlelight. Helen began clearing the plates. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Lane?" Helen asked. Maya hesitated. "Has Mr. Lane ever been sick?" Helen stopped, her expression unreadable. "Why do you ask?" "He seems stronger than I expected," Maya said carefully. "You know, for his age." Helen's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Lane's health is not your concern. He values privacy above all else." "Do not pry, Mrs. Lane." The warning was clear. But Maya's curiosity only deepened. That night, she could not sleep. The house was too quiet. Around midnight, she heard footsteps again, soft, steady, moving past her door. She rose and followed the sound down the corridor. A faint light spilled from beneath the door of the study. She approached slowly and peered through the small gap. Edward stood before a large mirror, his hands moving carefully along the edge of his silver hair. In one smooth motion, he lifted the entire piece away. Beneath it, his real hair was dark, thick, untouched by gray. Maya's breath caught in her throat. He straightened, his reflection younger, sharper, alive. The lines on his face faded with the disguise removed. He was not 77. He looked no older than 35. She covered her mouth, stepping back silently. The truth hit her like a wave. Everything, the calm voice, the steady movements, the strange choice to marry her, it all made sense now. He was pretending. She hurried back to her room, heart thundering in her chest. When she closed the door, she leaned against it, trying to catch her breath. The man she had married, the man she had believed to be a lonely old millionaire, was not who he claimed to be. And somewhere deep down, beneath the shock, another feeling began to stir: fear, curiosity, and something she could not yet name. Outside, the moonlight stretched across the garden. Inside, Maya lay awake, realizing that her new life was built on a lie, and the man sleeping somewhere beneath the same roof was a stranger wearing another man's face. Morning came, but the memory of what Maya had seen the night before refused to fade. Sunlight crept through her curtains, touching the floor in long golden stripes, yet her room felt colder than ever. She sat at the edge of the bed, replaying the image of Edward Lane standing before the mirror, removing his silver hair. The truth she had witnessed gnawed at her every thought. The sound of a knock startled her. Helen entered as usual, composed and distant, carrying the day's schedule on a small notepad. "Good morning, Mrs. Lane. Mr. Lane will not be joining you for breakfast. He has an early meeting in town." Maya hesitated, her heart still racing. "Does he often leave this early?" Helen glanced up briefly. "When business requires it. Is there anything else you need?" "No," Maya said quickly. "Thank you." When Helen left, the silence returned, pressing against her like weight. Maya walked to the window and watched as the black sedan rolled down the driveway, disappearing through the gates. She felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. She could no longer pretend she did not know. Edward was not 77 years old. He was younger, much younger, and hiding that truth for reasons she could not understand. But what reason could possibly justify such deception? The day dragged on quietly. Maya tried to distract herself by wandering through the mansion. Every corridor seemed longer than she remembered. In one of the smaller sitting rooms, she found a photo album resting on a table. Inside were pictures of Edward's supposed younger years, business events, charity galas, and smiling faces she did not recognize. Yet when she looked closely, the man in the photos seemed inconsistent. His features were too perfect, his age frozen in time. A shiver ran down her spine. None of it made sense. By afternoon, she found herself outside in the garden. The air was crisp and cool, and the leaves shimmered with leftover rain. She walked the stone path toward the lake, trying to quiet her mind. That was when she saw it, a tall figure standing near the greenhouse, half hidden by the vines. "Mrs. Lane," the voice called. It was male, sharp, and unfamiliar. She turned. A young man in a dark coat approached, smiling in a way that felt too confident. "You must be the new Mrs. Lane. I am Victor Lane, Edward's nephew." Maya nodded cautiously. "I did not know Mr. Lane had family nearby." Oh, I am not nearby," Victor said. "I came on business. My uncle and I have much to discuss." His tone carried an edge, like a blade hidden behind polite words. "I have to say you are not what I expected." Maya frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Victor smiled. My uncle has always been selective. The last time he entertained company, she wore diamonds, not worry. Maya stepped back a little, uneasy. If you will excuse me, Mr. Lane, I should go inside. Victor's voice softened. Forgive me. I only meant to understand the woman who has suddenly become part of this family. You see, Edward has a way of keeping secrets, and I like to know what those secrets cost. Before she could respond, Helen's voice echoed from the terrace. Mrs. Lane, the car has returned. Mr. Lane is asking for you. Maya turned and hurried toward the house, her heart pounding. She did not look back, but she could feel Victor's gaze following her until she disappeared inside. When she entered the study, Edward was already seated at his desk, removing his gloves. His expression was calm, almost unreadable. I see you met my nephew, he said. Yes, Maya replied carefully. He came to the garden. Edward's jaw tightened just slightly. He should not have approached you. Victor enjoys meddling in matters that do not concern him. Maya wanted to ask about the disguise, about the lie that had brought her here, but the words tangled in her throat. Mr. Lane, she began slowly. There is something I must ask. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Go on. She hesitated. Why do people say you are 77 years old? Edward's hand stilled. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the ticking clock on the mantel. Then he said, Because that is what they are meant to believe. Her breath caught. So it is true, she whispered. He studied her face carefully. You are observant, Mrs. Lane, perhaps too much so. There are things about my life that cannot yet be explained, but I assure you, no harm will come to you. Maya's voice trembled. You could have told me the truth. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze deep and steady. Would you have agreed to the marriage if I had? She opened her mouth, but no answer came. He was right. She might have walked away, never knowing what kind of man hid behind the mask of an old millionaire. I understand your anger, he said quietly, but I ask for your patience. When the time is right, you will know everything. Maya looked away, struggling between disbelief and something that felt dangerously close to empathy. Later that evening, as she prepared for bed, Helen knocked again. Mr. Lane will dine alone tonight, she said. He is not to be disturbed. Maya nodded, but her mind was far from rest. She stood by the window long after the lights in the study went dark. The moonlight touched the silver ring on her hand, making it gleam like a promise she no longer understood. Beneath the roof of the grand mansion, two truths now existed, the one she had been told, and the one she had seen with her own eyes. And somewhere in between them stood Edward Lane, a man too young to be 77, and too careful to reveal who he truly was. Days began to blend together inside the Lane estate. The rhythm of Maya's life settled into quiet repetition: morning tea with Helen, silent walks through the garden, and long evenings alone in her room while Edward disappeared into the study. Yet beneath that calm surface, the truth she had uncovered refused to sleep. Every time she looked at him, she saw not an elderly millionaire, but a man hiding behind silver hair and half-truths. The first snowfall came early that year. By late November, the lake behind the house had turned still and glassy. Maya stood at the window, her reflection pale against the frost. She wondered what kind of life she was living now, neither a wife in love nor a stranger entirely detached. Somewhere in between those definitions, her heart waited for something real. That morning, Helen entered carrying a basket of linens. Mrs. Lane, she said, Mr. Lane would like to see you in the conservatory after lunch. Maya turned. Did he say why? Helen gave her usual tight smile. Mr. Lane rarely explains himself. He expects you there at 1. After Helen left, Maya spent an hour pacing. Part of her wanted to demand the full truth. Another part feared what that truth might destroy. When the clock chimed 1, she made her way down the corridor. The conservatory was warm, filled with the faint scent of jasmine and lemon trees. Edward stood by the tall windows, sunlight striking his silver hair until it looked almost white. On the table nearby sat a chessboard already arranged for play. Thank you for coming, he said. I thought we might have a game. Maya managed a small smile. I have not played since I was a child. Then it will be a fair match, he replied. They sat across from each other. The quiet clink of wooden pieces filled the space between them. Edward moved deliberately, his attention fixed on the board. Yet his tone was gentle when he spoke. Helen tells me you walk the gardens often. Yes, Maya said. It helps me think. Oh, and what do you think about? She looked at him carefully. About truth, Mr. Lane. About how sometimes people hide behind masks, and how those masks can start to feel real. For a moment, his hand paused above a pawn. Then he placed it down and looked at her. You saw something you were not meant to see, did you not? Her heart raced. I did, she whispered, and I do not understand why. Edward exhaled slowly, his gaze soft but unreadable. Not every truth can be shared the moment it is found. Some truths need timing. If revealed too early, they lose meaning. That sounds like an excuse, she said quietly. Perhaps it is, he admitted, but it is the only one I have. They continued the game in silence. Maya won by accident. Catching him in a corner, he seemed not to mind losing. When she hesitated to take the final piece, he nodded. You can end it, Mrs. Lane. Sometimes victory simply means being brave enough to finish what you started. Afterward, he offered her tea. They sat near the window, watching snowflakes drift across the garden. The world beyond looked clean, untouched, as if it belonged to someone else. Mr. Lane, she said softly, I met your nephew, Victor. He said you keep secrets. He seemed angry about it. Edward's jaw tightened. Victor believes that wealth entitles him to every answer. He is wrong. Some things are earned, not given. Does he know who you really are? Maya asked. His eyes met hers. No, and for his sake, it is better that way. Before she could speak again, Helen appeared in the doorway. Pardon me, Mr. Lane. The accountant has arrived. He is waiting in the study. Edward nodded. Tell him I will be there shortly. When Helen left, Edward turned back to Maya. You are brave, Mrs. Lane. Most would have run from what you discovered. She gave a faint laugh. Maybe I should have. He smiled, just a small, almost invisible curve of his lips. I hope you never do. The world needs people who stay, even when they are uncertain. Later that evening, Maya found herself alone again. The mansion glowed with soft light from the sconces, the kind that made the shadows seem deeper. She wandered into the gallery hall where portraits of the Lane family lined the walls. Each face was proud and distant, painted in a way that made time irrelevant. At the end of the corridor hung a new portrait, Edward, standing beside the late Mrs. Lane. But now that Maya had seen his real face, she noticed the difference. The man in the painting looked older, with deeper lines, but the eyes were the same. His disguise had been modeled after his own portrait. The realization sent a chill through her. Behind her, a voice spoke quietly. You have a curious nature. She turned. Edward was there, leaning lightly against the doorway. The silver hair was still in place, but in the dim light, she could almost see the shadow of the man beneath it. I am sorry, she said. I did not mean to pry. You are not the first to wonder who I am, he replied. But perhaps you are the first who truly wants to know. Maya's throat tightened. Then tell me. He stepped closer, his expression thoughtful. In time, you will understand everything. But for now, I ask only this. Do not be afraid of what you saw. Fear has ruined more hearts than deceit ever will. He left her with those words, disappearing once again into the quiet halls of the mansion. Maya stood there long after he was gone, staring at the painted version of the man she no longer recognized. The mask, the lies, the tenderness hidden behind them, they tangled together until she could no longer separate one from the other. And as snow fell softly outside, she whispered to herself, what kind of truth is he protecting? And why does it feel like it has something to do with me? The answer, though still hidden, was already beginning to unfold within the walls of that silent house. The snow outside the Lane estate grew heavier as December approached. Days shortened, and nights stretched long and quiet, filled with the steady crackle of fire in the library and the soft ticking of antique clocks. Yet inside Maya Reed's heart, there was no peace. Every time she looked at Edward Lane, she saw two men, the one the world believed to be 77, and the one she had seen reflected in the mirror, young and unbroken by time. She tried to live as though nothing had changed. She kept to her schedule, took breakfast with Helen, and spent her afternoons reading or walking the frost-covered garden, but her mind never rested. Every word Edward spoke carried two meanings now. Every look held a question she could not ask aloud. One afternoon, while wandering through the east wing of the mansion, Maya passed a room she had never noticed before. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, faint music drifted through the air. A piano, soft and hesitant, as if someone were remembering a melody rather than playing it. She pushed the door open quietly. The room was large and filled with light from tall arched windows. In the center stood a grand piano covered with a white sheet. The sound was coming from a small music box sitting on top of it, its gears turning slowly. She stepped closer. The tune was simple but haunting. When she lifted the lid of the music box, she saw a tiny figure of a woman turning in slow circles, dressed in a porcelain gown. Beneath it lay an inscription. To Eleanor, my eternal note of grace. The name struck her. Eleanor Edwards' late wife. Before Maya could close the lid, a voice came from behind her. You found it. She turned quickly. Edward was standing at the doorway, watching her with a look that was neither anger nor surprise, just quiet resignation. I am sorry, she said quickly. The door was open. I did not mean to intrude. He walked into the room, his steps slow, his expression distant. You have nothing to apologize for. It was her room. The piano was hers too. He touched the music box gently, and the melody faltered, then stopped. She was the only person who could make this house feel alive. When she died, the music stopped too. Maya hesitated. You loved her very much. Yes, he said simply. And I failed her more than once. She looked at him, unsure how to respond. Why do you keep the room this way? He smiled faintly. Because letting it go would mean accepting that she is gone. The silence that followed was soft but heavy. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, scattering snow against the glass. Edward turned toward Maya. You remind me of her in small ways, he said. The way you speak softly when you are unsure. The way you look at the world as if it might still surprise you. Maya felt her cheeks warm. I am not her, Mr. Lane. I know, he said, and that is what makes it easier to breathe again. He crossed to the piano and pulled away the white sheet. The instrument gleamed faintly in the pale light. She used to play every morning. Would you try? I do not know how, Maya admitted. He smiled gently. Then let me show you. He sat beside her on the piano bench. His hands, steady and precise, guided hers to the keys. The melody he played was the same one from the music box, but now it carried a heartbeat, soft, fragile, alive. Listen, he said quietly. Every note is a memory. Every pause, a choice. Maya watched his fingers move, the grace of someone who knew how to control silence as much as sound. When she tried to follow, her notes stumbled, but he did not correct her. Instead, he said, perfection is not the goal. Honesty is. For a moment, the world outside seemed to fade. The music wrapped around them like a fragile thread, connecting two lonely souls in the vast emptiness of the house. When the song ended, neither spoke. Then Edward rose, his expression soft but guarded once more. Thank you for humoring an old man's nostalgia, he said. You are not old, Maya whispered before she could stop herself. He looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Then he smiled. You should rest, Mrs. Lane. It has been a long day. That night, Maya could not sleep. The sound of the piano still echoed in her memory. She had seen warmth in him that did not belong to a disguise. Beneath the lies, there was sincerity, and that confused her more than the deception itself. In the early hours of morning, she heard a noise in the hallway again. This time, she did not hesitate. She slipped from her bed and followed the faint sound of footsteps down the corridor. Through the half-open door of the study, she saw Edward once more before the mirror. The silver hair lay on the table beside him, and the face reflected back was young, alive, and weary. He looked nothing like the man she had met in the diner. He pressed his palms against the table and whispered something she could barely hear. I hope she never hates me for this. Maya's heart twisted. She stepped back silently and returned to her room. By dawn, the truth she had been trying to ignore became impossible to escape. Edward Lane was living a lie not to deceive the world, but to test something or someone. And though Maya did not yet understand the purpose, she could feel the pull of it tightening around her, drawing her closer to a man whose secrets were about to change both of their lives forever. The next morning dawned clear after a night of restless wind. Frost sparkled across the garden like dusted glass. Maya Reed stood at the window of her room, watching the sunlight reach slowly over the frozen hedges. She felt suspended between two worlds, one that told her she was the wife of a 77-year-old man, and another whispering that the man she had married was someone far younger, hiding behind a mask of silver and silence. Downstairs, the house stirred with the faint sounds of life. Somewhere a door closed softly, and the smell of coffee drifted up the hall. When Maya entered the breakfast room, Helen was already there, setting the table. "Good morning, Mrs. Lane," Helen said, her tone polite but cool. "Mr. Lane has gone into town. He will return by afternoon." Maya nodded. "Thank you, Helen." As the housekeeper turned to leave, Maya asked, "Helen, may I ask you something?" Helen paused, her posture stiff. "If it is about the household, certainly. It is about Mr. Lane," Maya said quietly. "How long have you worked for him?" "More than 10 years, Helen replied. "Why do you ask? Has he always looked the same?" The older woman hesitated. "Mr. Lane values discretion, Mrs. Lane. It is wise not to question things that are not meant to be explained. But you have noticed it, have you not?" Maya pressed gently. "You must have." Helen's lips tightened. "Mr. Lane is a complicated man. He has reasons for what he does. Some truths are burdens, not gifts." With that, she turned and left the room, leaving Maya alone with her uneaten breakfast. The words echoed in her mind, "Some truths are burdens, not gifts." Later that morning, Maya wandered the halls, trying to distract herself with small tasks. She polished the vase in the parlor, straightened the books in the library, and paused before the piano where they had played days before. But the melody that had once comforted her now felt like a riddle she could not solve. Just after noon, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the stillness. Through the window, Maya saw Edward stepping out, his posture straight, his expression serious. Another man followed Victor Lane, his nephew. The sight of Victor made her pulse quicken. His smile was polite but thin, as though he carried questions he already thought he knew the answers to. When the two men entered the foyer, Edward nodded at her briefly. "Mrs. Lane," he said in his formal tone, "we will be in the study for a short while." Victor's eyes lingered on her longer than necessary. "A pleasure to see you again, Mrs. Lane." She forced a small nod. "And you as well, Mr. Lane." Their voices faded behind the closed door. Minutes stretched into an hour. Maya could not help herself. Curiosity pulled stronger than caution. She moved quietly down the corridor until she was near enough to hear faint fragments of conversation. Victor's voice carried through the door, sharp and mocking. "You are playing a dangerous game, Uncle. Marrying a girl who barely understands what you are hiding. What are you really after?" Edward's tone was calm but cold. "You would not understand. Some lessons cannot be bought." Victor laughed softly. "Or perhaps you are just bored with your lies. How long do you plan to wear that mask before the world sees you for what you are?" There was a pause, heavy and tense. Edward spoke again, lower now. "You should leave before you say something you regret." Maya stepped back quickly as the voices grew louder. She returned to the hall just in time to see Victor storming out, his expression tight with anger. When he noticed her standing there, he smiled without warmth. "Be careful, Mrs. Lane," he said. "You might find the man you married is not a husband at all, but a performance." She wanted to reply, but he brushed past her and left through the front doors. The silence he left behind was sharp and uncomfortable. When Edward emerged from the study, his face was calm again, though his eyes looked distant. "Do not listen to anything Victor says," he told her. "He thrives on chaos." "Is he wrong?" she asked softly. Edward stopped walking. "About what?" "About you pretending to be someone else." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he sighed. "I cannot explain everything yet. But I can tell you this, I never meant to hurt you." Her voice trembled. "Then why deceive me at all?" He looked at her with a quiet sadness. "Because truth without trust destroys. I needed to know what kind of person you were before I told you who I am." Maya's throat tightened. "You married me to test me?" He shook his head slowly. "Not entirely. It began as that, yes. but I did not expect to find honesty in you that I had long stopped believing existed." His words left her breathless. "You do not have to hide behind lies, Edward." He smiled faintly. "If only it were that simple." He walked past her, pausing only to add, "Dinner will be early tonight. I have matters to prepare for tomorrow." She stood there long after he left, her mind spinning with questions that seemed to multiply faster than answers. The mansion felt colder, emptier, as though every wall had learned to keep secrets. That night, Maya looked out her window and saw him walking in the garden alone, his silver hair glinting in the moonlight. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw him remove his glasses and wipe his face, revealing the younger man beneath. The truth was closer now, so close she could almost touch it. But deep inside, she wondered if she really wanted to know the whole of it, because once she did, nothing between them would ever be the same again. And somewhere in the darkness of the winter night, the line between deception and protection blurred until she could no longer tell which one defined Edward Lane. The following day arrived beneath a pale winter sky. A thin layer of frost glazed the windows of the Lane estate, and the lake shimmered under the morning sun like frozen glass. Maya Reed stood by her dressing mirror, fastening the buttons on her modest gray dress. Her heart beat faster than she wanted to admit. Today, Edward Lane had promised to reveal the truth to his board, to the world, and to her. Downstairs, the house was already busy. Staff moved quietly through the corridors, setting the dining hall for the evening's event. Crystal glasses glinted under the chandelier, and silverware gleamed against white linen. The air smelled faintly of polish and tension. Helen appeared at Maya's door, holding a dark coat. "Mr. Lane asked that you wear this tonight," she said. "He will meet you in the West Hall at 7. "Thank you, Helen," Maya replied softly. "Is he nervous?" The older woman hesitated, her composure flickering for the briefest second. "Mr. Lane is a man who does not fear much, Mrs. Lane. But he values truth more than comfort. Tonight will test that." When Helen left, Maya glanced once more at her reflection. She barely recognized the woman looking back. Her hair was neatly pinned, her posture calm. Yet beneath it all, uncertainty churned. What truth could be powerful enough to shake a man like Edward Lane? By early evening, cars began to arrive. One by one, guests stepped out: businessmen, investors, reporters, all dressed in dark suits and heavy coats. The great doors of the mansion opened to a hum of polite conversation. Edward greeted each guest personally. He looked composed, his silver hair and calm demeanor exactly as the world expected. No one in that room could have guessed that the man standing before them was wearing a lie. Maya watched from the far end of the hall. She noticed the faint tremor in his hands as he signed a document for one of the investors. He looked calm, but his eyes revealed the weight he carried. When the clock struck 7, dinner began. The table stretched across the room like a runway of light, every plate and candle placed with perfect symmetry. Edward sat at the head, Maya beside him. The low murmur of voices filled the air. Halfway through the meal, Edward stood. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady. "Thank you for joining me tonight. I know many of you came expecting to discuss business, but this evening is about something far more important: truth." The room fell silent. Every face turned toward him. "For years," he continued, "the world has known Edward Lane as a 77-year-old recluse who built a fortune and withdrew from society. But the man you think you know does not exist. He is a shadow I created." Gasps spread across the room. Maya felt her pulse quicken. Edward reached up, his hand steady, and removed the silver hairpiece. The transformation was immediate. The face beneath was younger, still lined with time, but alive, sharp, and unmistakably that of a man in his 30s. "My name," he said, "is not Edward Lane Sr. I am his son, Edward Lane Jr. My father passed years ago, but before his death, he left behind a legacy poisoned by greed. I took his name and his image to test the world that once destroyed him. I wanted to see if decency could exist without wealth attached to it." The room erupted with shocked murmurs. Cameras flashed. Several board members exchanged stunned looks. Edward continued calmly. "I hid behind my father's name to expose those who valued inheritance over integrity. Many of you here invested not in business, but in an illusion. Tonight, that illusion ends." Maya sat frozen, every word sinking deeper. He had not lied about being a Lane, but he had hidden that he was his father's son. The disguise, the gray hair, the contract, all of it had been a test, not only for her but for everyone in his world. Victor rose suddenly from the far end of the table, his voice cutting through the noise. You deceived all of us. You humiliated your family name for a childish experiment. Edward met his gaze. Family is not built on blood or name, Victor. It is built on truth. Something you never cared to understand. Victor's face turned red with anger. You have no right to that fortune. The estate belongs to the Lane heirs, real heirs. Edward's tone did not waver. Then take it. If wealth is all that defines you, I want no part of it. The room fell into stunned silence. Edward turned to Maya. You see, Mrs. Lane, this is who I am. Not an old man testing kindness, but a son trying to rebuild his father's name through honesty. Maya's voice was soft but steady. And marrying me, was that part of your test too? He hesitated. The noise of whispers swelled around them. At first, yes, he admitted. But not anymore. You are the one person who saw past everything I pretended to be. Before she could respond, reporters began shouting questions. The noise became a storm of flashing lights and echoing voices. Edward raised a hand. No more tonight. You will have your statements tomorrow. He turned to Maya and said quietly, Please, come with me. They stepped out of the hall together into the quiet corridor. Behind them, chaos still rippled through the dining room. When they reached the grand staircase, Edward stopped. His face was pale but relieved. It is over, he said. The lie is gone. Maya searched his eyes. But at what cost? He smiled faintly. If truth costs peace, it is still worth the price. Outside, the snow began to fall again, slow and silent. Inside the mansion, Edward Lane Jr. had finally shed the ghost of his disguise. But as the last camera flash faded, Maya felt the first tremor of something she could not name, a fear that honesty, once set free, might destroy more than lies ever did. The night after the reveal was restless and cold. The mansion, usually so still, buzzed faintly with leftover tension. Reporters had camped outside the gates, their camera lights flickering like distant stars through the falling snow. Inside, servants whispered in corners, unsure what would happen now that Edward Lane's truth had shattered the illusion that had kept the estate quiet for so long. Maya Reed lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling. She could still hear the echo of Edward's words from the night before. Not an old man testing kindness, but a son rebuilding his father's name through honesty. It should have made sense, it should have brought peace, but instead, it left her heart heavy. Everything she thought she knew about her husband had changed. The 77-year-old philanthropist she had pitied was gone. In his place stood a man of 35 who had hidden behind another identity to test both greed and kindness. And somehow, she was caught in the middle of that story. Not as a wife, not as an accomplice, but as a witness. When dawn came, she rose and went downstairs. The house smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke. Helen was already in the hall, speaking in hushed tones with one of the footmen. Her face was tense. Helen, Maya said softly. Where is Mr. Lane? Helen looked up, startled for a moment, then composed herself. He has been in the study since 4 this morning. The phone has not stopped ringing. The board, the reporters, the lawyers, everyone wants an explanation. Maya hesitated. And you? Do you think less of him now? Helen paused. I think Mr. Lane has always been a man trying to fix a broken story. But truth has a way of demanding its due. He may not have chosen the easiest path. Maya nodded slowly. May I see him? Helen hesitated, then said, Yes, but prepare yourself. He is not the man he was yesterday. When Maya entered the study, Edward was sitting at the desk surrounded by open folders and letters. The disguise, the silver hair, the aged glasses, the slow movements was gone. The man before her looked alive and exhausted, the strain of the past night etched across his face. He glanced up and smiled faintly. You should be resting. I could not, she said, neither could you. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. No, I could not. Every phone call this morning is about damage control. The board wants reassurance. Investors are panicking. They do not know how to trust a man who built his company on a lie, even if that lie was meant to expose the truth. Maya moved closer. You did what you believed was right. He looked up at her, his eyes tired. Right intentions do not always lead to right outcomes. She took a slow breath. So what happens now? He rose and walked toward the window. Now I face the consequences. Victor has already filed a petition to challenge the ownership of the estate. He claims I falsified records. If the court agrees, I lose everything. Lane Industries, the foundation, the house, all of it. Maya's chest tightened. He cannot take what you built. He can try, Edward said quietly, and he might succeed. The law is not about truth. It is about proof. Every document ties back to my father's name, not mine. That was part of the disguise. Now it may become my undoing. Oh. She stood beside him, watching the snow outside fall in heavy sheets. If you lose all of it, what will you do? He turned to her, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked uncertain. I do not know. I built this life to test others, but I never prepared to rebuild one for myself. There was silence between them, filled only by the soft crackle of the fireplace. Finally, Maya said, You once told me that kindness was rare. Maybe now it is your turn to accept it. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. You mean your kindness? Yes, she said. Because no matter how many names you wear, I have seen the man underneath, and he is not the one the world will try to destroy. Edward stepped closer, his voice low. You are stronger than you think, Maya. When I first met you, I thought I was the one offering rescue. Now I see it is the other way around. Before she could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the drive broke the quiet. Helen entered quickly. Mr. Lane, it is Mr. Victor. He is demanding to see you. Edward sighed. Let him in. Moments later, Victor strode into the study, his expression a mix of triumph and fury. Congratulations, cousin, he said sharply. The world knows your secret. I hope it was worth it. Edward's tone stayed calm. What do you want, Victor? To take back what belongs to the real Lane family, Victor said. You played your little game pretending to be your father, but it ends now. The board wants you out, and I will make sure of it. Maya stepped forward. You are talking about greed while standing in front of the man who gave everything away to prove it still exists. Victor glared at her. You think he cares about anyone but himself? Ask him how many people he lied to before he found you. Edward's voice cut through the tension. Enough, Victor. Leave the house before you say something you cannot take back. Victor smiled coldly. You will regret this, Edward. I promise you. He turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Maya looked at Edward. He will not stop, will he? No, Edward said quietly. But neither will I. He crossed to the desk, gathering a stack of documents. Tomorrow, I will call a press conference. If the world wants truth, I will give them all of it. Every lie, every reason, every mistake. I will not hide again. Maya's voice was steady, though her heart trembled. Then I will be there. Edward looked up at her, his eyes softening. You have already been there, from the start. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing every footprint from the night before. Inside, two lives that had been built on deception were beginning to find their way towards something that finally looked like truth, even if it meant losing everything else to find it. The morning of the press conference broke gray and silent. A steady drizzle misted the grounds of the Lane estate, softening the edges of the world. From her window, Maya Reed could see a line of news vans already parked outside the gates, their antennas reaching toward the clouds like impatient fingers. Reporters huddled under umbrellas, their voices muffled by the rain. Inside the house, there was movement everywhere. Assistants carried folders through the halls. The house staff whispered in anxious tones. Helen moved briskly from room to room, giving quiet instructions. The atmosphere felt like the last breath before a storm. Maya found Edward Lane in the study. He was standing by the fireplace, his back to her, staring into the flames. The disguise was gone completely now. He looked younger than he ever had since she met him, but the weight in his eyes was unmistakably older. You do not have to do this alone, Maya said softly. He turned to face her. I began it alone. I should finish it that way. She shook her head. No one finishes anything alone. Not truth, not redemption. Edward smiled faintly, the smallest curve of gratitude touching his lips. You always know the right thing to say. I only say what I see, she replied. He stepped closer. And what do you see? Maya met his gaze steadily. A man who is tired of hiding but still afraid of being seen. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Helen entered, holding a folder. "Mr. Lane, the car is ready. The reporters are waiting at the conference center." Edward nodded. "Thank you, Helen." As Helen left, Maya said, "Before you go, there is something you should know." He turned back to her, curious. "Your nephew was here early this morning," she said quietly. "He spoke to one of the reporters at the gate. I heard him from the corridor. He is planning to release documents that claim you forged your father's will." Edward's face hardened, though his tone stayed calm. "That would not surprise me. Victor has always believed that the family name was a weapon to protect his pride. He will not rest until he uses it against me." Maya hesitated. "What if they believe him? Then I will give them something greater to believe in," Edward said. "The truth." He took his coat, but before he could leave, Maya reached for his hand. "Promise me one thing," she said. "When this is over, no matter what happens, you will not disappear again." "Oh." He looked down at their joined hands, then up into her eyes. "I promise." The drive to the conference center took less than 30 minutes, but every mile felt longer. Maya sat beside him in the back seat, the rhythmic sound of rain on the roof filling the silence. Outside, the city loomed in shades of steel and fog. When they arrived, the building was already crowded. Security guards guided them through a side entrance. Reporters pressed forward, cameras flashing. Questions rang out through the air, sharp, insistent, hungry. "Mr. Lane, did you deceive your investors? Are you really your father's son? Is it true your wife did not know about the disguise?" Edward kept his composure, guiding Maya toward the front of the room. A stage had been set up with a long table and microphones. He paused before stepping into the lights. "You do not have to stay," he murmured. "I want to," she replied. When he faced the cameras, the room fell into silence. The air buzzed with expectation. Edward rested his hands on the podium. "Good morning," he began. "My name is Edward Lane, Jr. For several years, the world has known me under a false identity. I pretended to be my late father, Edward Lane, Sr., in order to continue his legacy while testing those who claimed to serve it. What I did was deception, yes, but it was not done for greed. It was done to reveal how easily truth can be traded for status." He paused. The crowd leaned forward. "I discovered that honesty is rarer than gold," he continued. "I found men who praised generosity only when it benefited them. But I also found something else, someone who reminded me that compassion can exist even when there is nothing to gain. That person sits before you, now my wife, Maya Reed." Maya froze under the sudden attention, her cheeks flushing. "She believed in kindness when I gave her every reason not to," Edward said. "If there is any redemption in this story, it belongs to her, not me." The room erupted in murmurs. Some reporters nodded, others scribbled furiously. Then Victor's voice rang out from the back. "You speak of redemption as if it erases your lies. What about the inheritance you forged? What about the people you deceived?" Edward looked directly at him. "You speak of inheritance, Victor, but you never understood its meaning. Wealth is not what our family left behind. It is what we choose to do with what remains. You want the estate? Take it. But understand this, I no longer build my life around the value of things. I build it around the value of truth." The confrontation silenced even the reporters. For a long moment, all that could be heard was the hum of the cameras. Edward straightened. "I will cooperate fully with any investigation. Every document, every account, every statement will be open for review. I ask for no forgiveness. I only ask that you judge me by the honesty I show now, not the lies I once told." He stepped back from the podium. Applause began slowly, uncertainly, then grew. Some stood, some clapped politely, but the message had reached them. As he walked off the stage, Maya met him halfway. "You did it," she whispered. He nodded, his eyes shining with quiet relief. "For the first time in years, I can breathe." Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds began to thin, and sunlight broke through, pale but real. For Edward Lane, Jr., the storm had not fully passed, but for the first time, he had faced it without a mask. And for Maya Reed, standing beside him in that moment, truth no longer felt like a burden. It felt like freedom. The days following the press conference unfolded like the slow melting of winter snow. What had once been heavy and suffocating began to shift and soften. The media storm that surrounded Edward Lane Jr.'s confession spread across every headline in the country, but the chaos outside the gates of the Lane estate finally began to quiet. Inside the mansion, the silence that returned felt different now. No longer the silence of secrecy, but of aftermath. Maya Reed walked through the long hall that led to the study, carrying 2 cups of tea. The late morning light filtered through the windows, catching the dust that hung like soft mist in the air. She found Edward by the fireplace again, surrounded by stacks of letters and documents. He was no longer hiding behind the disguise of age, but the weight on his shoulders still lingered like an invisible cloak. "You have been up since dawn," Maya said gently, setting one of the cups on the table beside him. "You need to rest." Edward looked up with a faint smile. "Rest will come later. For now, I have to make sure every record is clear. I will not leave another shadow behind." She sat across from him, wrapping her hands around her cup for warmth. "You have already done what most people never would. You told the truth, even when it meant losing everything." He leaned back slightly, watching the flames. "And yet it feels strange. For years I wanted the truth to free me. Now that it has, I realize it does not erase what came before. It only exposes it." Maya nodded quietly. "That is what truth does. It does not erase pain, it gives it shape." Edward smiled at that, though his eyes were tired. "You always find words that make sense of things I cannot explain." "I just say what I see," she replied softly. He reached for one of the envelopes on the desk and handed it to her. "Read this." She unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, handwritten in a neat, deliberate script. "To Edward Lane, Jr. After reviewing your confession and public statement, the board has voted unanimously to suspend your direct authority over Lane Industries pending investigation. The foundation will remain active under temporary trusteeship. However, several members expressed admiration for your integrity and are willing to reconsider once the audit concludes." Maya looked up. "They are not shutting it down." "No," Edward said, "but they are taking it away from me for now. It is fair. I built my father's company on a lie. It deserves to stand on its own truth before I touch it again." She studied him for a long moment. "You sound at peace with it." "I am," he said. "Because for the first time, I have nothing to hide." A knock came at the door. Helen entered, her face calm but her voice softer than usual. "Mr. Lane, a visitor has arrived." "It is Mr. Victor." Edward's expression did not change. "Send him in." Helen hesitated before stepping aside. Victor Lane entered, his usual arrogance dulled. His suit was sharp, but his eyes betrayed unease. "I thought I made it clear that we have nothing more to discuss," Edward said evenly. Victor exhaled slowly. "I am not here to argue. I came to apologize." The words hung in the air like something fragile. Maya watched silently as Victor continued. "I wanted to destroy you. I thought you were mocking our family name. But when you stood there and told the world the truth, I realized you were doing what none of us had the courage to do. You faced the ghosts instead of burying them." Edward studied him carefully. "And what do you want now?" Victor's tone softened. "To make things right. The board asked me to represent them in your absence. I want to rebuild the foundation with you, not against you." Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. "You expect me to believe that?" "No," Victor admitted. "I expect you to watch me earn it." The room fell quiet. The only sound was the steady crackle of the fire. After a moment, Edward said, "If you are sincere, then start by helping me reopen the scholarship fund," my father began. "That was his real legacy, the one everyone forgot." Victor nodded. "I will." As he turned to leave, he paused and looked at Maya. "You must be the reason he found his balance again," he said quietly. "He was never this steady when he was pretending to be an old man." "Oh," she gave a polite smile but said nothing. When Victor was gone, Edward let out a long breath. "Do you believe him?" Maya shrugged slightly. "People can change when they see what truth costs." Edward looked at her with a faint spark of admiration. "You make me want to believe that." That afternoon, the mansion felt lighter. The staff moved through the halls with quiet relief. The news outside began to shift away from scandal toward reflection articles, speaking of courage and accountability instead of deception. As evening fell, Maya found Edward in the garden. The snow had melted enough to reveal the stone path beneath. He was standing by the pond, his breath misting in the cold air. "Beautiful, is it not?" he said softly when she joined him. The way the world resets itself, even after the storm. She nodded. It reminds me that even broken things can start again. He looked at her then, not as a test subject, not as a contract wife, but as the person who had walked beside him through the unraveling of every lie. You once told me that I should not disappear again, he said. I want you to know I intend to keep that promise. But I cannot ask you to stay bound to the ruins of what I built. You deserve a life unburdened by my mistakes. Maya's voice was steady. And you deserve someone who does not see those mistakes as chains. I am not here because of the life you built, Edward. I am here because of the man you chose to become. He smiled softly, the cold air turning his breath to silver. Then perhaps for the first time, I have built something worth keeping. The last of the sunlight glimmered on the pond, reflecting two figures standing side by side, no longer bound by deception, but by the quiet, fragile beginnings of trust. The first signs of spring began to show along the edges of the Lane estate. The snow that had covered the gardens for months had melted into the soft ground, and the air carried a faint scent of earth and new beginnings. Yet inside the house, change came more slowly. Maya Reed woke early, as she had every morning since the press conference. She still found herself moving through the quiet halls of the mansion like a visitor rather than its mistress. The staff greeted her warmly now, but she sensed the unspoken question in their eyes: would she and Edward stay after all that had happened, or would the mansion fall silent again? When she reached the study, the door was half open. Edward Lane Jr. sat at his desk, the morning light spilling across stacks of files. His sleeves were rolled up, and his expression carried the calm focus of a man rebuilding piece by piece what had once been shattered. You are working before breakfast again, Maya said, her tone gentle but teasing. He looked up and smiled faintly. Habit. Some mornings I still wake up expecting the disguise to be there, as if the old man would take my place again. Maya stepped closer. You do not need him anymore. No, Edward said quietly. But sometimes I miss the silence that came with pretending. When you hide behind someone else, the world leaves you alone. When you stand as yourself, it never stops asking questions. She set a cup of coffee on the desk. Then let them ask. At least now, you have nothing left to hide. He nodded and took a sip. The board has accepted Victor's proposal. The scholarship fund will reopen next month, and the foundation will continue under joint leadership. It is more than I expected. And Victor? Maya asked carefully. He is doing what he promised, Edward said. Perhaps guilt can be useful after all. No. The words carried no bitterness, only quiet acceptance. Maya hesitated before saying, There is something else I wanted to ask you. He looked up. What is it? My brother's surgery, she said softly. The doctors at St. Anne's called yesterday. They have scheduled it for the end of next week. Edward's eyes softened. That is wonderful news. How is he feeling? Excited, she said with a smile. Nervous, too. He still asks how we could afford it. I told him a friend helped. Oh, you could have told him the truth, Edward said. I will, she replied. But not yet. I want him to heal before he knows the whole story. He nodded slowly. Then we will go together. I want to meet him properly this time, not as a stranger with an offer, but as myself. The simplicity in his tone made her chest tighten. For the first time, the idea of the future did not frighten her. Later that afternoon, they walked the gardens together. The ground was still damp, and patches of snow lingered beneath the hedges. But the world was waking up. The air smelled faintly of wet grass and cedar. Maya stopped near the stone bridge that crossed the pond. This is where everything started to change, she said quietly. The day Helen called you to the study, and I realized you were not who you pretended to be. Edward smiled. And yet, somehow, you stayed. She looked at him. I stayed because you needed someone to remind you that truth is not the same as punishment. Sometimes it is just a second chance. He studied her face for a moment before saying, And what about you? What do you want now that the contract between us no longer matters? Maya hesitated. I want peace. For my brother, for myself, and maybe for you too. Edward's voice was quiet. You have already given me that. They walked on in silence until they reached the greenhouse. Inside, the air was warm and fragrant with new blooms. Edward brushed a layer of dust from the old work table and uncovered a small notebook. Eleanor used to keep a list of every plant she grew here, he said softly. She believed the garden could heal people if they tended to it with patience. Maya smiled gently. Then maybe that is something we can do together. Start new. Edward looked at her with gratitude. You make that sound simple. It is not simple, she said. But it is honest. That evening, they dined together in the small breakfast room rather than the grand hall. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the sound of rain returned softly against the windows. Edward poured wine into 2 glasses and raised his in a quiet toast. To beginnings, he said. Maya lifted hers. And to the truth. For a long while, they simply talked about her brother's recovery, about the plans for the scholarship fund, and even about the future of the estate. But beneath their calm words, something deeper stirred a quiet understanding, that the bond between them was no longer built on circumstance but on choice. When the clock struck 10, Maya rose to leave. You should rest, she said. Edward watched her for a moment, then said, Maya. She turned back. Do you ever wish we had met under different circumstances? He asked. She smiled softly. If we had, you would not have seen me for who I was, and I would not have seen you for who you are. Oh, Edward's voice lowered. Then perhaps everything happened exactly as it should. She nodded once, her heart steady. Perhaps it did. As she walked back toward her room, the sound of the rain deepened, washing against the glass like a lullaby. Somewhere behind her, Edward remained by the fire, watching the flames flicker and fade. For the first time in a long time, both of them felt the quiet promise of something real, not born from deception, but from the courage to rebuild after it. And in that soft, uncertain beginning, the mansion that had once held secrets finally began to feel like a home. A week later, the Lane estate felt different, lighter, quieter, and almost human again. The heavy air of secrecy that had once filled every corridor had vanished, replaced by the faint scent of blooming lilies from the garden. The staff spoke more freely now. Laughter returned to the halls, soft and careful at first, like the early signs of spring pushing through frost. That morning, Maya Reed stood by the grand staircase, fastening the buttons on her beige coat. A small suitcase rested by her side. Helen appeared with a gentle smile, holding a folded scarf. The car is ready, Mrs. Lane. The driver will take you straight to the hospital. Thank you, Helen, Maya said warmly. And please tell Mr. Lane I will return in 2 days. I do not want him to worry. Helen nodded, hesitating for a moment before saying, He already does, but he hides it well. Maya smiled softly. He always does. Outside, the morning sky was pale and calm. The drive to Street Ann's Medical Center took less than an hour. Maya spent the entire ride staring out the window, her thoughts drifting between past and present. For months, her life had been a tangle of pretense and truth, but today it felt clear. Her brother's surgery marked a turning point, not just for him, but for her too. When she arrived, nurses guided her to the recovery wing. Daniel was awake, his small face pale but smiling. You made it, he whispered weakly. Maya took his hand gently. Of course I did. How do you feel? Better, he said. The doctor said I get to go home soon. Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled through them. You did so well, Danny. I am so proud of you. A nurse entered quietly, adjusting the monitors. He has been asking about the man who helped pay for his surgery, she said kindly. I told him he would meet him soon. Oh, Maya nodded, her heart full. Yes, very soon. Back at the estate, Edward Lane Jr. spent the afternoon in the garden, pruning the overgrown hedges with steady hands. The air was crisp, carrying the faint hum of bees near the greenhouse. He paused often, not from fatigue but from reflection. Every snip of the shears felt symbolic, cutting away the remnants of deceit to make room for something living. Helen appeared at the edge of the path. She called, she said. Her brother's surgery went well. Edward exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. Thank God. She will be back in 2 days. Helen paused, then added softly, You should tell her what you told me. He looked up, confused. And what is that? That you are afraid, Helen said simply. Afraid she will not stay when she realizes she no longer has to. Edward's gaze dropped to the shears in his hand. Maybe she should not. I brought enough pain into her life already. Helen smiled faintly. Perhaps pain was the bridge, not the barrier. Do not let her walk away without knowing what she means to you. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, Edward walked through the house, stopping outside Maya's empty room. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, mingling with the soft gold light spilling across the floor. He whispered to himself, "When she comes back, I will tell her everything, no masks, no conditions. Just truth." Oliver. At that same moment, Maya sat by her brother's hospital bed, watching the steady rhythm of his breathing. She thought of Edward, the man who had once entered her life disguised as someone twice his age, the man who had tested her heart without realizing he was testing his own. She smiled faintly and whispered, "He deserves peace, too." The world outside the hospital window was calm, the kind of calm that comes after a long storm. For the first time in years, both Edward Lane Jr. and Maya Reed were exactly where they needed to be, on the edge of something new. Something fragile, but entirely real. And though miles apart, both knew that when they met again, there would be no contracts, no lies, and no disguises, only two hearts learning how to begin again. The sun was already low when Maya Reed returned to the Lane estate. The car rolled slowly through the wrought iron gates, past the long driveway lined with budding trees. The house stood quiet against the pale orange sky, its windows glowing softly like lanterns. For the first time since she had first arrived months ago, it did not feel intimidating. It felt like a place that had been waiting. Helen met her at the door with a rare warmth in her eyes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Lane," she said gently. "How is your brother?" Maya smiled. "He is recovering well. The doctor said he can go home within the week. He kept asking about Mr. Lane." Helen nodded knowingly. "Then perhaps it is time they meet." Maya hesitated. "He would like that. So would I." As she made her way down the hall, she found Edward in the garden, his back turned, pruning the last of the rose bushes near the fountain. The sound of her footsteps on the stone path made him glance over his shoulder. When he saw her, his expression softened instantly. "You are back," he said simply. "I told you I would be," she replied, smiling faintly. He set the shears aside and wiped his hands on a cloth. "How is Daniel?" "Resting, finally. The surgery went better than expected. The doctor says he will make a full recovery." Relief washed across Edward's face. "That is the best news I have heard in months." They stood there for a moment, the sound of water trickling from the fountain filling the silence between them. Then Maya said softly, "I think he would like to meet you soon. I told him about the man who helped him, though not everything yet." Edward nodded. "He deserves to know everything. When you are ready, I would like to tell him myself." Maya studied him quietly. He looked different now, not because of the absence of his disguise, but because of the peace that had replaced the old tension in his eyes. "You have changed," she said. He gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Perhaps I am finally becoming the man I pretended to be." She tilted her head. "The kind man?" "The honest one," he corrected softly. They walked along the edge of the garden, the sky deepening to shades of violet and gold. The scent of wet grass and blooming magnolia filled the air. Edward stopped near the stone bridge, the same place where so many of their first conversations had taken place. "There is something I need to tell you," he said. Maya's heartbeat quickened. "What is it?" "When I first offered you that arrangement," he began, "I thought I was in control. I believed that testing you would somehow prove something about the world, about honesty, about love. But the truth is, you were the one testing me without even knowing it. You showed me what it means to be trusted, and what it means to deserve it." She looked at him quietly, her voice steady. "And now?" "Now," he said, taking a slow breath, "I no longer want a life built on conditions or contracts. I want a life that is real, whatever that means, however uncertain it is." Maya's eyes softened. "Then stop talking about what you want and start living it." For the first time, he laughed a sound so natural, it startled even him. "You always did have a way of turning my confessions into instructions." "Someone has to," she replied lightly. He reached for her hand, hesitant but sincere. "Maya, I do not know where this road will lead. But I would like you to walk it with me, not as part of an arrangement, but as yourself, as us." "Ard." She looked down at their joined hands, then up into his eyes. "You already know my answer." The last light of day shimmered on the surface of the fountain, casting ripples of gold across the garden. Neither spoke again, because there was nothing left to hide. For the first time, truth did not hurt. It simply lived quiet, steady, and certain between them. And as evening settled over the estate, Edward Lane Jr. and Maya Reed stood together, not as test and subject, not as a contract couple bound by circumstance, but as two people finally free to choose each other in the open light of honesty. The following week arrived with clear skies and the promise of warmth after months of cold. The Lane estate no longer felt like a place built to hide. It breathed differently now, open and bright. Maya Reed stood by the front entrance, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered from the garden that morning. The sunlight caught in her hair, turning it into soft gold. The sound of tires on gravel made her look up. A car rolled slowly through the gates and stopped near the fountain. Edward Lane Jr. stepped out, followed by a young boy with curious eyes and a thin frame. It was Daniel. His small hands gripped the strap of his satchel, and his gaze darted from the grand building to the gardens around him. Maya's smile spread instantly. "Daniel!" He broke into a grin and ran toward her. She knelt, hugging him tightly. "You look stronger already," she said softly. "I feel stronger," he said proudly. "The doctor said I can start walking more every day." "That is wonderful," she whispered, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "You have no idea how proud I am of you." "No." Daniel looked up at Edward, who stood a few feet away, his expression gentle but hesitant. "Is that him?" the boy asked quietly. Maya nodded. "Yes, that is Mr. Lane, the man I told you about." Daniel turned and walked up to Edward, his small footsteps steady. "Thank you, sir," he said shyly. "My sister said you helped save me." Edward crouched down so they were eye to eye. "You saved yourself, Daniel. I just helped clear the path." The boy smiled, tilting his head. "You do not look old at all. I thought you were an old man." Maya laughed softly, embarrassed. "That is because I told the story a little differently," she said. Edward smiled. "That is all right. I used to look older than I was. Pretending teaches you things." Daniel blinked. "Like what?" Edward thought for a moment. "That pretending is easy, but being honest is harder and more important." The boy seemed to consider that, then nodded wisely. "My teacher says the same thing." The three of them walked toward the garden together. Daniel's steps were slower than usual, but he insisted on walking the whole way. Maya kept close beside him, her hand hovering protectively near his shoulder. Edward carried a small basket filled with fruit and sandwiches. They settled under the old oak tree by the pond. The breeze carried the scent of water and wildflowers. Birds chattered in the branches above. It was peaceful in a way that felt earned. Daniel nibbled on a sandwich and looked around curiously. "You live here?" he asked Edward. "Yes," Edward said. "For now. But I hope this place becomes more than a house again. A home for people who need a chance." Maya glanced at him, surprised. "You mean the foundation?" He nodded. "I want to turn part of the estate into a sanctuary, a small retreat for families in need, children who need time to heal. It is what my father once dreamed of doing, but he never got the chance." "Oh, that is beautiful," she said softly. Daniel looked up. "So, it will be like a big garden for people who are sad?" Edward smiled gently. "Exactly like that." The boy's eyes lit up. "Then can I help plant things when I come visit?" "You can help lead the garden," Edward said. "Every good place needs a caretaker." Maya watched the exchange in silence, her chest tightening with quiet emotion. She had seen Edward in many forms, cold, guarded, hidden, but this version of him, open and kind, was the most truthful of all. Later that afternoon, when Daniel dozed off on the picnic blanket, Maya and Edward sat nearby, speaking in low voices. "He likes you," she said softly. "I like him too," Edward replied. "He reminds me of who I used to be before the world told me I had to be someone else." She looked at him thoughtfully. "You know, I used to think your disguise was cruel. Now I think maybe it saved you in some way." He turned to her, curious. "How so?" "It forced you to see the world without privilege," she said. "To understand what it means to be judged by nothing but your actions. Maybe that is what your father wanted for you all along." Edward was quiet for a long moment before saying, "If that is true, then meeting you was the lesson I was meant to learn." Maya smiled faintly. "You always say things like that and make it impossible to argue with you." He laughed softly. "That is not a bad habit to have." They sat in companionable silence, the sound of the pond filling the air. The sunlight shifted through the trees, painting patterns of gold and green across the ground. When Daniel stirred awake, he blinked sleepily. "Can we come back here again?" he asked. Maya brushed his hair from his forehead. "Of course." Edward leaned forward slightly. "Next time, you can help me plant the new seedlings in the greenhouse. But you must promise not to tell Helen if we make a mess." Daniel giggled. "I promise." As the day faded and the shadows lengthened, Maya watched Edward walk with Daniel ahead of her, their silhouettes framed by the soft evening light. Something inside her settled a sense of calm she had not felt in years. She realized that the mansion was no longer just a symbol of wealth or deception. It was becoming what it was always meant to be, a place where truth could finally grow. And as the three of them walked back toward the house, the last light of day fell behind them like a closing curtain on a story that was no longer about lies, but about beginnings. The days that followed Daniel's visit unfolded in gentle rhythm. For the first time, the Lane estate no longer echoed with loneliness. Laughter returned to its halls, the light, youthful laughter of a boy rediscovering joy, and the quiet, steady laughter of two adults who had finally found peace. The world outside might have still whispered about Edward Lane Jr.'s scandal and his great unmasking. But inside those walls, life had begun again, in its simplest form. Maya Reed noticed how the air felt different now. The tension that had once hung between her and Edward was gone. What remained was something grounded, honest, and slow to grow, like the new seedlings Edward and Daniel had begun to plant together in the greenhouse. One bright morning, Maya stood at the doorway of that same greenhouse, watching them work. Edward knelt beside Daniel, showing him how to press soil around the roots of a young rosebush. The boy's laughter rang clear as he clumsily dropped a handful of dirt on Edward's shoe. "Careful, Daniel," Edward said, smiling. "Gardening is like truth. It takes time and patience, not force." Daniel giggled. "That is what my teacher says about math, too." Maya leaned against the doorframe, smiling softly at the scene before her. The man she had once thought to be a 77-year-old stranger had become someone entirely different, a man of warmth and purpose. When they finished, Edward wiped his hands and turned to her. "You are awake early," he said. "I could not sleep," she replied. "I wanted to see how the garden is coming along." He motioned for her to come closer. "Then see for yourself. Daniel is turning out to be quite the apprentice." The boy stood proudly. "We planted 6 rose bushes and 2 lavender rows." Maya crouched beside him. "You did all that?" He nodded, grinning. "Mr. Lane said each plant has to grow with care, just like people do." Edward's eyes met hers briefly, and she felt the quiet meaning beneath his words. She rose to her feet, brushing her hands against her dress. "It looks beautiful," she said softly. "It feels like this place is finally alive again." Edward smiled faintly. "That was the idea. For too long, this house existed as a monument to things lost. I want it to become a place that gives life again." They walked together toward the pond, Daniel running ahead to chase a butterfly. The air carried the scent of wet grass and sunlight. Edward paused by the old stone bridge, resting his hand on the railing. "Do you remember the first time we stood here?" he asked. Maya nodded. "You looked at me like I was about to run away." "Oh," he chuckled quietly. "I thought you might. Most people did when they learned who I really was, or rather, who I was pretending to be. And yet," she said gently, "you never stopped pretending until I forced you to." Edward's expression softened. "You did more than that. You reminded me that truth is not weakness, it is freedom." Maya looked out over the water. "Then keep living like that. No more disguises. No more walls." He turned to her, the light catching in his eyes. "That is easier now. You make it easier." Before she could respond, Daniel's voice called out from across the garden. "Mr. Lane, look." They both turned. The boy was crouched beside a small patch of earth near the fountain, holding up a tiny green sprout. "It is growing," he said, his voice full of wonder. Edward walked over and knelt beside him. "That one will be strong," he said. "It took root faster than I expected." Danielle looked up. "Like us?" Edward smiled. "Yes, Daniel, like us." Maya watched them with quiet affection. For the first time in years, she felt as though her world had aligned. The brother she had fought so hard to protect was safe, and the man who had once tested her heart now stood beside her with nothing to prove. That afternoon, After Daniel had been taken home to rest, Edward and Maya sat in the small library overlooking the garden. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, pooling over the books and soft rugs. The air smelled faintly of tea and paper. Edward leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "I received a letter this morning from the foundation board," he said. "They want me to return as an advisor. Not as the old Edward Lane Sr., but as myself." "That is a good thing," she said. He nodded. "It is, but I am not sure if I want to. For once, I do not want to live behind a desk or a title. I want to live out here, where I can see the results of what we build with our hands." Maya tilted her head. "Then do that. You do not need a company to make a difference." He smiled faintly. "I think I just needed someone to tell me that." For a long while, they sat in comfortable silence. The wind rustled outside, carrying the faint sound of laughter from the gardeners working beyond the walls. When Maya finally spoke again, her voice was quiet. "You have built something, Edward. Not just the garden, not the foundation, but trust. Between us. Between everyone who lost faith in you." He looked at her, his eyes steady. "And you, Maya, you taught me how to build it. You were the one person I could not buy, test, or predict. You were simply true." Her heart softened at his words, but she did not answer. Instead, she reached across the table, placing her hand over his. Outside, the sun slipped lower, bathing the garden in amber light. The reflection on the pond shimmered like glass. For the first time, the estate no longer felt haunted by the past. It felt ready for tomorrow. And as Edward and Maya sat there in the fading light, neither needed to speak of love. It was already there, growing quietly between them, as steady and certain as the roses in bloom. Spring deepened across the Lane estate, bringing with it colors that had not touched the grounds in years. Tulips bloomed in neat rows along the path. The trees began to fill with new leaves, and the pond shimmered under soft sunlight. It was as if the earth itself had chosen to forgive the past. Inside the house, that same sense of renewal seemed to stir quietly between Edward Lane Jr. and Maya Reed. Life had settled into a new rhythm. Edward spent his mornings in the greenhouse, working alongside the small staff hired to care for the expanding gardens. In the afternoons, he joined Maya for tea on the veranda that overlooked the lake. Their conversations had shifted from the weight of truth to the lightness of the future plans for the foundation. Updates on Daniel's recovery, and dreams that neither of them had dared to speak before. That morning, Maya arrived in the greenhouse carrying a small wicker basket. "Helen says you forgot breakfast again," she said gently. "You cannot live on coffee forever." Edward looked up from where he knelt among the seedlings, smiling faintly. "I had coffee and a slice of toast. That counts as breakfast." She shook her head. "That counts as negligence." He stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. "You sound like Helen." "I will take that as a compliment," she replied. She set the basket on the table. Inside were slices of fruit and fresh bread. "Eat. Or I will tell Daniel you skipped your meal again." Edward laughed softly and obeyed. "I see you and your brother have formed an alliance against me." "Oh, he just wants to make sure you stay healthy enough to teach him how to plant more roses," she said, smiling. As they shared breakfast beside the rows of seedlings, Maya noticed how calm Edward had become. The man who once lived behind layers of disguise now seemed to breathe freely, his eyes clear and steady. The shadow of guilt had faded from his expression, replaced by quiet determination. "Do you ever think about your father?" she asked softly. He nodded, thoughtful. "Every day, but not with anger anymore. I think about what he built and what I nearly destroyed by trying to protect it the wrong way." "You did not destroy it," Maya said gently. "You redefined it." He looked at her, the corners of his mouth lifting. "You always know how to see the best in things." "Maybe I just learned to look past the surface," she said. "After all, you taught me that appearances can lie." He laughed quietly. "Touché." "Oh?" Their peaceful moment was interrupted by Helen entering the greenhouse, holding a letter. "Mr. Lane," she said. "A courier just delivered this from the Board of Trustees. They asked that you read it immediately." Edward took the envelope, his brow furrowing. He broke the seal and scanned the page in silence. Maya waited, studying his face for a clue. When he finished, he exhaled slowly. "They want me back," he said finally. "The board has completed its review. They found no fraud, no misconduct, only deception meant to protect, not to profit." They are reinstating my name to the foundation permanently. Maya's face broke into a smile. Edward, that is incredible news. He nodded, though his tone remained reflective. It is more than I deserve. Maybe, she said, but it is exactly what you earned. Helen excused herself quietly, leaving them alone again. Edward folded the letter and set it on the table. For years, I thought redemption meant fixing what I had broken, he said. But now I see it means learning to build differently. Maya reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Then let us build differently together. He looked at her, his eyes warm with gratitude. Do you mean that? I do, she said softly. You once offered me a contract, but this time, I offer you something without conditions. Partnership. Not because I owe you anything, but because I want to. Edward's voice dropped, sincere and steady. Then I accept. They sat in silence for a while, the sunlight streaming through the glass panes and painting their faces with golden warmth. The faint hum of bees buzzed in the air, mingling with the quiet rhythm of their shared breath. Later that afternoon, they walked through the estate to the edge of the lake. The water reflected the pale blue sky, rippling with the light wind. Edward stopped near the dock, his gaze thoughtful. When I first brought you here, he said, this house was nothing but walls and secrets. I remember thinking that no matter how much wealth surrounded me, it still felt empty. Maya nodded. And now? He smiled faintly. Now it feels like home. Because you turned it into one. She looked at him quietly. You gave it back its heart, Edward. You let it breathe again. He took her hand gently, holding it without words. The touch was simple, but carried the weight of everything they had endured. The lies, the fear, the unraveling, and the rebuilding. As the sun began to set, a soft orange glow spread across the lake. The estate behind them stood peaceful, no longer haunted by the ghost of falsehood. Instead, it hummed with quiet purpose. Edward turned to Maya, his voice calm. Tomorrow, I will return to the foundation not as someone hiding, but as someone who wants to lead with truth. But tonight, I just want to stay here. With you. She smiled, her voice gentle. Then stay. They watched the water in silence as the first evening stars appeared above. In that still moment, neither needed promises or declarations. What they had built spoke for itself: honesty, patience, and a love that had grown from the ashes of deception. And as the last of the sunlight faded, Edward Lane Jr. and Maya Reed stood hand in hand, no longer defined by the past but by the quiet certainty of what was yet to come. The following months unfolded like a slow sunrise, quiet, steady, and full of promise. The Lane estate, once a place of secrecy and silence, had become a sanctuary of life. The gardens bloomed in full color, the greenhouse thrived, and the sound of laughter drifted through the open windows more often than ever before. Every morning, Maya Reed walked the path to the greenhouse, where Edward Lane Jr. worked among the flowers. He had traded boardrooms for soil, suits for rolled-up sleeves, and ambition for peace. Yet there was no loss in his transformation. If anything, he had gained something deeper, a purpose that did not depend on power. One crisp morning, Maya brought him a letter sealed with the crest of the Lane Foundation. It is from the board, she said, handing it to him. They said it is important. Edward opened it carefully. As his eyes moved across the page, his brow softened, and a quiet smile touched his lips. They have approved the sanctuary project, he said. The foundation will fund the restoration of the old orphanage on the edge of the city. It will become a refuge for children recovering from illness or hardship. Maya's eyes brightened. Edward, that is wonderful. He nodded. It was the last unfinished dream my father left behind. I think he would be proud. She touched his arm gently. I know he would. The moment held a quiet grace, the kind of peace that comes when the pieces of the past finally fit together. As weeks passed, the project became their shared mission. Maya helped oversee the design of the new children's wing, ensuring every room was filled with light and color. Edward managed the funding and logistics with the same precision he had once used in his corporate life, though this time his heart led his decisions. Daniel, now stronger and full of energy, became their unofficial helper. He drew pictures for the children who would someday stay there, taping them to the blueprint walls as little promises of hope. One afternoon, while they reviewed plans in the garden, Maya looked up at Edward and said softly, "Do you ever think about how far we have come?" He smiled, the sunlight glinting off his hair. "Every day. I think about how none of this would have happened if not for one impossible choice, a young woman saying yes to a strange proposal from a man pretending to be 77 years old." Maya laughed quietly. "When you say it like that, it sounds absurd." "It was absurd," he said, "and yet it was the beginning of everything true." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the gentle sway of the rose bushes nearby. The air was thick with the scent of spring and memory. As the sanctuary project neared completion, Edward decided to host a small opening ceremony. The guest list was modest foundation members, local families, and a few close friends. But for Edward and Maya, it was more than an event. It was closure. The morning of the opening arrived bright and clear. Children's laughter echoed across the grounds as families gathered. The restored building gleamed with white walls and wide windows. A new sign hung above the entrance, "The Lane Sanctuary, where healing grows." Edward stood at the podium with Maya beside him. His voice, calm and sure, carried through the courtyard. "Years ago," he began, "this foundation was built on wealth and legacy. But somewhere along the way, it lost its soul. I spent years trying to preserve what my father left behind, and in doing so, I became lost myself. I hid behind masks, behind lies, meant to test the goodness of others. But life has a way of revealing truth in unexpected places." He turned slightly, his gaze finding Maya. "I found mine in a diner in Chicago, when a woman with tired eyes and a brave heart showed me that kindness does not need to be tested, it simply needs to be trusted." The crowd listened in silence. Maya's eyes shimmered, but she smiled through the emotion. Edward continued, "Today, this sanctuary is not just a tribute to my father's memory. It is a promise to build a world where healing and honesty matter more than wealth or power. Because true leadership is not about control. It is about compassion." When he finished, the applause that followed was warm and unhurried. The children clapped the loudest, their laughter rising like music. Later that afternoon, as the crowd dispersed and the sun began to set, Edward and Maya walked through the empty hallways of the sanctuary. The rooms were simple, but filled with light. On one wall hung Daniel's drawings, bright images of flowers, smiling faces, and sunlight breaking through clouds. "He did these," Maya said softly. "He wanted the children to see hope first when they wake up." Edward smiled. "He understands more about life than most adults do." Ozer. They reached the main window, overlooking the garden. Outside, the children were running through the grass, chasing bubbles blown by one of the nurses. The scene was quiet, almost sacred. Maya turned to Edward. "You know, for a long time, I thought this story would end with us walking away from everything. But now, I see it was never about escape. It was about rebuilding." He looked at her, his voice gentle. "And you were the one who taught me how." She shook her head. "No, you taught yourself when you chose truth over fear." They stood in the fading light, the golden glow of the setting sun wrapping around them. Outside, the laughter of children echoed a sound that carried the weight of healing, of second chances, of grace. After a long silence, Edward said softly, "Maya, there is something I have wanted to ask you for a long time." She looked at him, curious. "What is it?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside, resting on velvet, was a simple silver ring with a single clear stone. "This time," he said, "there is no contract, no disguise, and no conditions. Only truth. Will you stay, not because of obligation, but because of choice?" Maya's eyes filled with tears she did not try to hide. "You already know my answer," she whispered. Edward slipped the ring gently onto her finger. "Then this is not a new beginning," he said softly. "It is a continuation of everything honest that we fought for." As they stood there, the last light of day spilled through the window, bathing them in gold. Outside, Daniel's laughter rang across the garden, mingling with the sound of wind through the trees. The Lane Sanctuary would open its doors to countless lives in the years to come. But its first miracle had already happened not in a hospital or a boardroom, but in two hearts that had learned that love built on truth was the most powerful healing of all. And as the evening settled over the estate, Maya Reed and Edward Lane Jr. walked hand in hand into the soft light of the future proof, that even the most unlikely beginnings can lead to the truest kind of forever.